Okay, I'm going to talk to the movement. Hello, hello, the movement. You are unmuted. Hello, hello, movement. Can you hear me? You are muted yourself, if that's what's going on.
It's been about 3 months since I've used Discord, so I apologize.
Okay, no worries.
Yeah, so, my name's Nora. I use she, her, hers pronouns. Um, and yeah, do I need to do any further introduction, or how would you like to conduct this
Oh, I guess,
conversation?
sure, two things. Since we've had a recent pronoun debate, do you also accept they, them? What are your thoughts on that?
I prefer she, her, hers.
Mm-hmm.
They, them is fine if, people don't know me. Obviously I'd kind of prefer she, her, hers, but, I'm not gonna wring someone's arm over it. It doesn't make too much of a difference to me.
Okay, and then second thing. So just to fulfill the shill, so you told us who you are. Is what did you do? And what if anything would you like to shout out? It can be a personal channel or like a book or a media that interests you.
Yeah, okay. I am a senior. I'm a college senior. I study European intellectual history at Yale. I plan on becoming an academic, even though academia is a hellscape at the moment with few job opportunities and little chance of me making, a reasonable living off of that.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, so
Did you say that you're
I
16 years old?
no, I'm 21.
Okay, someone thought you were 16 years old.
Oh no. um yeah, no, no, I'm 21, college senior,
Cool.
just finished grad school apps, so yeah,
Congrats. Good luck.
thank you. Um yeah, and thing to shout out, I have my Twitter at Theodor Awhoreno. Um I think it's very amusing. That's THEO DORAWHORENO. Yeah,
Sure.
books
I'll.
I'd recommend. I'll kind of echo your last discussant, and I think Mark Fisher's Capitalist Realism is a good starting place for anyone who's interested in theory. It's very accessible. It's interesting, plenty of pop culture references, but his thesis is pretty counterintuitive. So that's probably what I'd recommend to anyone interested in theory.
Sure. Well, thank you for the recommendations. I popped your Twitter link in the chat, and people are free to follow.
Awesome.
Um, do you think the phrase "a horno" is anti-sex work? Right, horno.
I mean, I wouldn't consider myself to be anti-sex work, and it's just a pun, kind of self-deprecating humor, referring to myself as a whore, and then
Adorno.
I'm yeah, um, not that deep in this particular case.
Well, as someone whose name is itself a pun, I can't hate too much. Um, so you DM'd me on Twitter about empiricism as it relates to my politics. So you said your critique was not empiricism in general, the way I applied it in my politics. Um, you can totally change what you want to talk about. So if that isn't what you're interested in, we can change it. What would you say the main contention or like topic of discussion you would like to focus on is?
Yeah, I mean, I think it seems to me that empiricism, use of various economic, sociological, social scientific studies, what have you, seems to play a central role in your politics and the
Mm-hmm.
arguments you make and how you present your politics to others. Um, and it has I would say, a disproportionate focus on matters of policy and governance. Um, that I don't really see as part of a productive or effective communist politics. I mean, I don't know if you can, if you think there's a strong or like a large difference between communism or socialism, whether you consider yourself a communist or socialist.
I just call myself
However,
socialist because communist has an even worse connotation.
okay. Yeah, but well, in any case, for building, the type of, just compassionate society we want to see, I don't think having like, I guess, how do I put this? I
Mm-hmm.
think a focus on empirical social science and presenting your politics primarily through that lens.
Mm-hmm.
People do that primarily when they want to enter into a sort of deliberation with left liberals, with conservatives. You want to speak the language of liberal democratic governance. Um, I think this ultimately, I think the root of our disagreement is on whether or not electoral politics is a worthwhile avenue for any like socialist, leftist, communist, whatever. You want to have that, you want to be engaging in that, conversation about matters about policy, governance, state administration, regulation, etc., because
Mm-hmm.
you believe that we can, enter into electoral politics, elect socialists, people who are sympathetic to our cause, reform the state, nationalize industry, and this is, how we achieve our, ideal society. I don't think such a transformation is possible through electoral politics. In fact, I'm kind of pretty pessimistic about the possibility of like a radical transformation of social relations. Period. Um,
Mm-hmm.
I'm extremely pessimistic about that. But in any case, I think if you're trying to build power, I think the it's perhaps most important to focus on concrete and material needs and I guess more on the like I guess I would make the more what people would consider more theoretical appeals rather than like the empirical social scientific appeals that you make. I think those are the ones that we should be making. They're more effective as winning people over, winning working class people over, which should form the bedrock of any like socialist or leftist movement. That I think that's my general position. Sorry for the extended monologue, but I just wanted to make my views clear in detail.
Sure. So I try to summarize it as this: that you think that I think that empiricism allows me to speak the language of governance and of like current ideologies, which enables to enter into governance to allow reform, election of socialists, and eventually reaching socialism. Whereas you think that reform is unlikely, you're pessimistic, and then you think that theoretical arguments are more effective at winning people over, and that will enable the formation of a true leftist movement. Is that a good brief summary, even if it misses some of the nuance?
Yeah, I would say so.
Okay. So I don't necessarily. I would say that I think there's kind of two main disagreements that I see in this. The first is that I think that the role of empirics isn't just speaking the language of governance. It's also about. It's also directly about being more effective at winning people over. What I'll call persuasion. The question is. So persuasion is like a real thing, and it happens. Ooh, good night, mom. Love you. See you tomorrow. The basic, so like in U.S. elections, about 80% of the like difference between various electoral outcomes can be attributed to persuasion, like changing party, and 20% can be attributed to people like increasing turnout or decreasing. So persuasion matters. Persuasion is important. I'm not going to disagree with that, and I would say that persuasion is even more important for like a very small minority group like leftists. So do we agree with like the general concepts there, or?
I mean, yeah, I agree that like persuasion, effective rhetoric, messaging, a campaign having a good messaging strategy or a good media strategy. Yeah, that does obviously play a role in election outcomes. I'm not. Yeah, I don't
Sure.
disagree with you on that.
Sure. So we agree. Persuasion is how you get the people in part. It's so I guess one of the ways I would think about this is, do you agree that there isn't just this like latent mass of like socialists in the United States just waiting for someone to speak theory to them and they'll like wake up? Or do you agree more with like the previous speaker that we need a cultural change and we need to genuinely change people's ideology so that they believe in things in a more leftist lens? Which is your view closer to?
So okay. So there's two issues here that I see. Like one, I think the people that we would want to see like forming the bedrock of an effective socialist movement by and large are completely disaffected. if you want to look at voter turnout, the people, it's roughly 50%, roughly half of the U.S. population will turn out for a presidential election, maybe a bit more, maybe a bit less.
Sure, it's about 60%, but yeah,
Yeah, okay,
number's
50,
not important.
60%.
Number's not
Yeah.
important. Sure.
That 40% who are not mailing in ballots, who are not turning up at the the local polling place, whatever.
Mm-hmm.
Vast majority of those people, minorities, we're talking black and brown people and working class people. These are the people that would be materially incentivized to vote for, if you're that committed to, the current framework of American electoral politics. These would be the people that would be incentivized to vote for Democrats. And these, in theory, these are the people who, probably in your estimation, are the ones who are going to be pushing socialists into elected office. So it's just a matter of reaching out to those people and convincing them to turn out to the polls.
So is the theory then, I'm sorry to pick you in the boxes, but I guess the basic question is, are these people not turning out because they aren't convinced of socialism? Or are they not turning out because they don't have a candidate who is saying these things? Is it a turnout argument, the latter one, or is it a persuasion argument, the former one? I'm sorry to try and put you in a box, but which one is closer?
I think working people, the thing is that even when you present, I think I'll phrase it in terms of the boxes that you're laying out for me.
Sure.
I've canvassed for progressive candidates in New Haven, where I go to school.
Mm-hmm.
And New Haven is it's about 130,000 people, lots of black and brown people, lots of working class people. There's lots of stereotypes about it being crime ridden, obviously very classist, very racist, blah blah blah. The stereotypes are very classist and racist, but the point is that there are a lot of poor and low income residents in this city, and you go door to door and you talk to these people and say, this is where your local polling place is, this is the day of the election, here's the candidate I'm going for, this is what the type of legislation they support. And they can recognize that what you're telling them will, the policies that you're explaining to them, that you're telling them about, will benefit for them. But at the end of the day, they're like, look, it doesn't, their view is I will turn up to the polling place and vote, and over the next 4 years, nothing will change.
Good night, Mr. Nita. See you tomorrow. Sorry.
I think regardless of candidate, working class people are so disillusioned with our current political system that, and there are structural inequities in place that make political participation for them very, very difficult, that unless you have some brilliant new mass organizing strategy, you are not going to get the political participation of the masses, the working class. And I don't think you're going to see, and that's not just talking about if you favor electoral politics, that's just talking in general. This is why I don't think there's really any hope for a just socialist society.
So I guess the major themes, and I will be using empirical evidence here, so you'll have to forgive me. The major themes, I think this leans towards I'm not trying to box you in. This leans towards the side that working class people want to vote leftist, but they don't because they're disillusioned because electoral politics doesn't change anything. And we could talk about, that's a second argument that we'll get to in just a moment. But I think that it's also more interesting to focus on whether that's actually true, that they do believe that there's a significant difference between the parties, and whether they need to be culturally convinced of leftist stuff. So one of the things I mentioned earlier in my talk with Pranav is saliency. The most salient issues in American electoral stuff right now is social stuff. People vote left or right because of immigration, race, religion, and education. Those are all really big predictors of which way people vote, and they're all fundamentally about cultural issues like abortion, immigration status, like gay marriage. And so the term that David Shor uses, I quite like David Shor, SHOR. I can send you his Twitter. Basically, he suggests that economic issues has lost salience. So it's not just that working class people are disenfranchised, they also just care less about economic issues. Everyone does. Especially highly educated people care less about economic issues, and they're voting more based on social issues. So I think part of what you're seeing there is that not only do they think maybe there won't be real economic change between the parties, but also they don't care about that as much as they care about gay marriage or other social issues. So I guess that's the one perspective that I'd point to. Another very simple one is that a lot of people are very misinformed about the economic positions of the Republican Party. There's a really neat article from Data for Progress, which shows that most people, most Republicans rather, don't understand the economic positions of the Republican Party. So they show that 81% of Republicans think that their party wants to protect those with pre-existing conditions, that that 38% of Republican voters think that their party wants to expand Medicaid, and that 30% of Republican Party voters think their party wants a $15 minimum wage.
I mean, Republican voters being misinformed isn't exactly news, though.
It's not new, but I guess what I'm trying to say is there's a big chunk of like Republican voters that genuinely, they don't vote on economic issues, and two, they don't understand the difference between the two parties. It's a significant chunk. We're talking maybe 50% even of the voters.
But like again, that gets back to like, was it like, likely voters who were surveyed in this case? Was it just anyone who is of voting age registered to vote? Because the thing is that like certainly people they'll call these, whoever runs these surveys will call people up. They'll whether it's online, over the phone, whatever, they'll contact these people, and the people that stay on the line that complete the survey online will give their answers. But how many of these people are actually turning out to the polls? And like like, so the thing you brought up about Shore, about the thing that the study of Shore's that you mentioned in regards to like social issues have a lot more salience at this in our in the current moment. I don't really see it as relevant. It doesn't matter. There's large portions of the population who are completely removed from any.
Sure,
like,
but I think that the fact that they're removed doesn't answer why they're removed. And so I think that's the gist of the question between turnout. Do we simply need to say the right things and then they'll vote? Or persuasion? Do they not believe in the things that we're promoting? And so I think the suggestion is that one, they don't turn out because they don't care about these things. So that seems like a persuasion thing. And two, they genuinely don't understand even the minor differences in like the big sense between like the Democratic and Republican Party. So again, that seems like a persuasion or misinformation thing.
Yeah. I mean, I guess I would agree with those. Like I don't see necessarily where the disagreement is that I just don't see that you think that you can just like have like, what is the system, like mass information system that you can filter through the airwaves your excellent persuasive strategy. You include a little online pamphlet, and then suddenly it goes to all the Republican voters, and like what they're going to be like, what is the mechanism, what is the organization through which your strategy of mass persuasion is going to occur?
Sure. I mean, so this is why I will shill Hirsch's Politics is for Power, and I'll shill the concept of deep canvassing. Have you heard of either? And this is not like a gotcha question. Just, are you aware?
Wait, repeat Hirsch's first name.
Hirsch. Oh, I actually don't know his first name. His book is Politics is for Power. I don't know his first name, though.
Let me look this up. Give me a second.
I'll send you a link to the book no matter what. So, one moment. I gotta evangelize, right?
Hirsch. Okay, no, I'm not familiar with it, but continue.
Sure. I mean, the basic point of deep canvassing and of Hirsch's idea is that having long conversations, year-round organization, and grassroots connections, personal connections, can genuinely change minds, and they can genuinely increase voter turnout. That's like the fundamental, most important thesis. And the other big part of I-10 Hirsch, apparently I-10's Hirsch's book, is that there has been this decline of saliency of economic issues. He actually calls this the Post-Materialist Thesis. People's incomes rose fast enough and high enough that they no longer, a significant chunk of people, particularly like the high educated, no longer care as much about like economic issues. They're increasingly caring about social issues, which is a really interesting thesis.
I mean, yeah, so some of this makes sense to me. Some of this is what I, agree with. And of course, like, I'm a socialist. I, think grassroots organizing is good, and, it can work. but the thing is that to work on the level that we, would require for the type of radical change that we want to see, I just don't see where that political will is going to come from. Like, you seem to think that, like, the socialist left is genuinely ascendant in the United States. I look around and see, like, what, 3 to 4 members of Congress and a handful of, like, DSA endorsed candidates, in
Sure.
state legislators, like, and what is this supposed to snowball? I'm not convinced that there's any signs of that snowballing into, like, a true, widespread
Well,
movement over the next, like, what, even 20 years.
so I guess I think that we've gotten 2 steps removed. So I'd be happy to talk about that. But the original question is like, why are empirics useful, or why is theory useful? And so I suggest it's useful because it's for persuasion. And so like there's related research that empirical stuff, logical stuff can persuade people's minds. Again, that's empirics that I could cite. And that's one of the reasons I think empirics are useful, because being able to prove, for example, that certain types of arguments are more effective at changing mind is more useful to like demonstrate that you're doing good work.
I mean,
And then you
this
contrast
gets
it with
back.
like saying theory, whereas I think that generally people who are like, hey, we just need to provide theory to people. Hey, be like, hey, we're going to establish, like worker democracy via the dictatorship of the proletariat. Hey, we're going to abolish the commodity form. Hey, we're going to do all of these things. These sort of more theoretical arguments. I don't think there's a lot of evidence that they seem to be very compelling. If I had to point to
So I
one anecdote, and I promise I'll finish so you can get in. If I had to point to one anecdote, there's this neat story from Zoe Baker or Anarchopac. Who points out that like when back in it's this funny example, back in 1909 there was a workers library in I think Hamburg, and nobody checked out Karl Marx. Everyone checked out fiction. Everyone checks out the fun things. Nobody likes to read theory.
I think this is where I've been a bit misconstrued. I
Sure, then
because
clarify.
when you yeah,
I
yeah,
don't want to straw man.
yeah, no, I mean, when you summarized my basic positions at the beginning of the conversation, you mentioned, like, I value theory over empirics
Mm-hmm.
in with regard to, persuasion. Which, the general characterization of my position was fair and accurate, but, like, this is like that was like the one point where I was like, well, it's not exactly precise, but, whatever, that's the general point. I
Sure.
would say that it's not that I think, I'm not going to walk up to someone's, door, knock on the door and be like, hello, good sir, have you read Das Kapital? Well,
Mm-hmm.
here's the Spark Notes. Um, I wouldn't say that, like, in when if our goal is to persuade, I prefer theory over, a more empirical social scientific approach.
Sure.
Would say I because the thing is that this gets back into, like, what do people find convincing, and, like, rattling off policy proposals or demonstrate, saying, like, well, these political scientists or these economists demonstrated how a social wealth fund would actually, be
Mm-hmm.
really beneficial for you, blah blah blah. Like, people don't like that. That's very abstract. It's this is like, this is ultimately the problem I have with this very empirical focused politics, is that it aspires to, like, this transcendent rationality that for working people it's very removed from their concrete realities, their, like, material suffering.
So
So, like, when
to
persuading to, you talk about, oh, you're not getting paid enough, your boss is shitty to you, you can't afford to send your kids to a decent school, the better public school is across town, and your hours
Mhm.
don't allow you for you to drive your kids, so they have to tend to the shittier public school right near you, and, like, we don't have busing in the city, like, you appeal to, like, their immediate material needs. That is how you persuade people. Empirical social scientific studies does not matter at all when it comes to persuading working class people, or in general. Obviously there are exceptions, and
Sure.
this
So
isn't to
I just want
say
to be
that, like,
clear. So are you claiming here that like more theoretical arguments are more appealing, like sort of like saying like, hey, here's this Marxian solution to this problem, or like, hey, like we should abolish the commodity form, sort of stuff, or like, or are you just saying that like appealing to studies doesn't convince people like on the spot, and generally it's actually like appealing to things that matter in their personal lives is what's appealing? Because I
I
guess
mean, look,
go ahead.
you finish.
No,
Sorry, I tend
no,
to
go ahead.
interrupt, so you finish.
I
Oh,
it's better to have like polite interruptions than monologuing. So
yeah, that's okay. I know I'm terrible at interrupting, so please feel free to interrupt me as well.
Hmm.
Um, yeah, so I guess it's just like because our goal is to persuade in order to engender political participation, whether that comes for turning out at a strike, joining us in canvassing, whether in your case, turning out to the polls.
Hmm.
Um, and at the end of the day, it's just that I don't think studies are the way. It's basically taking that person's immediate material concerns,
Well,
and
sure. So
a working class person is very disaffected, and it's convincing them that in your case, which is I don't think
well,
electing these people is going to produce change, but it would be convincing those people that their immediate material conditions are going to improve as a result of their participation.
Well, but that's actually precisely one of the things that's so interesting is that when you do put this stuff to the direct vote, people often are willing to vote for left-wing policies. Virtually every state in the union has now expanded Medicaid, or is it Medicare? Whichever one is the one for the poor. That has been expanded by voters in virtually every
Medicaid.
state, including Medicaid. Then for by like even in red states because people want it to be expanded. The example I point to recently is that Florida voted 53% for Donald Trump, and it voted 63% or so for minimum wage. So a $15 minimum wage. Sorry. So the idea here is people can be persuaded for these things when you have concrete policies. And I guess the argument that I think that is kind of being alluded to here is generally when you're like talking to people, you don't cite a study in casual conversation. And this one I'm citing it because I want this to be like a more educational conversation. But the average one, you don't cite a study, but you are citing, hey, here's this policy and here's how it fixes it for you. And having the ability to do that, and like knowing that it's true is somewhat important. I think that focusing on more abstract solutions to that, like, hey, isn't capitalism shit, does not actually appeal as well to people as focusing on these concrete policies, which seem very popular. That's why when it's been on the ballot, it almost always wins, even in these red states. That's kind of the whole point.
No, I mean, well, I mean, the thing is that okay, one, I agree that it's not that I had like obviously if you can take like a very simple policy like higher
Mm-hmm.
minimum wage, like people have no problem connecting that to their immediate material needs. They can easily see how that will improve their day-to-day lives. There's no
Mm-hmm.
need for abstraction, for complex the complex minutia of policy. It's just, oh, I will get paid a higher wage, I will have more money to pay my rent, pay my bills, buy small luxuries for
Well,
myself.
but so let's say that
um
someone comes back to you and says, "Hey, but I'm going to be unemployed because my employer can't pay $15 minimum wage." And let's say that you don't believe in studies. Like you're going to refuse rather at least to say studies to the other guy. How can you like attempt to show to them that they aren't going to lose their job due to a federal minimum wage?
I mean, like, and this is the thing is that you assume that ultimately the person who's coming to you like this, like
Mm-hmm.
who's saying this $15 minimum wage is going to cause me to become unemployed,
Mm-hmm.
like there are very few working class people who are one, engaged enough in politics to be having those conversations and seeking out those conversations, and then two, I would say that the number of like working class people who are like, I don't want a $15 minimum wage because I believe there's going to be this specific repercussion, i.e., me getting fired because my boss doesn't want to,
Well, I mean,
pay
just
the extra like $3. I just it's a hypothetical that I view as like so uncommon.
I
It's
don't
not
think
really
it's
worth
that's
addressing.
hypothetical. So like among Republican voters who earn less than 40K, so generally the working class, and generally because they're Republican, the white working class, if we want to use that term, 53% of them support $15 minimum wage. 47% of the Republican working class does not support a $15 minimum wage. I don't think it's really that uncommon. It's half of half the country, roughly. It's it,
Okay, I mean, wait, I no, 47% of a particular income bracket within the Republican Party.
Well, sure. I mean, within the rest of the Republican Party, it's higher. The Republican working class is more $15 minimum wage than the rest.
Yeah.
It's more
Okay,
like
sure, but
slightly over 50% of the Republican Party overall.
I would argue that the way you change someone's mind, like I think you assume that like you attribute a degree of like rationalism and like you know, a strong belief in empirical social science, and that's how
Hmm.
people arrive at their beliefs. That if I simply show them the right studies, that this is how they'll be converted. And like at the end of the day, that's not how you convince. Like you know,
So I don't think
like
it's about
most people
showing
don't
someone's
have that
studies.
complex of ideologies.
Well, so I guess the thing if I want to appeal to something here, it's just again to appeal to the empirical research on persuasion. Um, it's that like you can do these things, you can show people evidence, and it does change their mind. Whether you can apply that in like a conversation, like a spoken one, is a somewhat like more abstract topic. Usually in spoken conversation, I would say something like, "Hey, you know, there's a lot of evidence, and a lot of experts seem to think that the minimum raising the minimum wage won't cause a lot of people to lose their jobs." And I might even mention one economist by name to like lend it some credence, right? That's the sort of thing you say. And I guess I would just appeal to there are two studies particularly that I'm referring to here. One is about I mean, you know, if we want to go through it, if I want an example of like changing people's minds, the example first study that I would cite that's relatively simple is this one, which found that there were two ways that were equally effective in Hungary among I forget how many people, like I think 1,000 or something. Either one, mocking people who believed in a Jewish hyper conspiracy that controlled the world, or two, logically breaking down why a Jewish hyper conspiracy that controlled the world is absurd. Both of these tactics were equally successful at reducing beliefs in
I
said
mean,
conspiracy. And more
you
generally, this can be
seem
replicated in this study.
you
This is the
seem to
replication
be
study.
conflating my like cautiousness with regards to like empiricism's uses in like persuading people with like an outright rejection of logic, which
Well, it's
like
not that it's a
that
rejection of
like
logic. It's about what persuades people. It turns out that telling people stats does work. That's one of the things the Hungary study literally does. It's like, hey,
I
Jews are
mean
only like 1% of your country, and they aren't like 50% of the rich or something. They can't possibly be controlling all of the media, sort of thing.
but the thing is that yeah, like certainly I think offering an empirical argument can persuade a certain amount of people, but the question is whether or not an empirical argument is more effective or one that is, you know, there are other ways of, you know, making an argument that Jews aren't controlling the world besides the fact that
Well,
like
sure. So, I mean, if we say this is a bad example, the latter study does it for like 50 topics, um, and they generally found the way that they summarize this is that the effect of factual correction of like providing people counter evidence is about 1/3 as large as the effect of ideology, meaning that you say that you're like liberal or conservative or Republican or Democratic. So it's pretty big. There are pretty big political gaps. 1/3 as big of a gap is a really big one. Um,
I
so
mean
I
this doesn't address my main concern that like like and the thing is that we'd have to take it on a case by case or issue by issue basis, like, you know, what, you know, list a policy, you know, someone is on one side of it, we're trying to convince them, or you know, list a policy, list a political issue, etc. We're trying to convince one person who's on one side of it to come to the other side. And you
mhm.
know, you can use empirical methods, you can use other forms of argumentation, and my point is, in which the problem I have here is that I from what you've explained of these studies, they don't actually seem to, you know, more empirical modes of argumentation versus other modes of argumentation, the effectiveness of the two compared, I
Sure.
guess is.
So this does not prove like if my claim was that the best way to convince someone is with a study. These studies don't necessarily prove that, but they do prove that it works. Um, I guess.
Well, I think
Go ahead.
this like the thing is like I'm not disputing that like some people will be convinced or swayed a bit by
Well,
studies. Like I
I mean, so
obviously don't
previously you
dispute that.
suggested that people don't have a very rational way to approach these things, and I guess my suggestion is it does seem like they're somewhat rational. You can literally just tell people facts, and it does change their mind. Um, and so, you know, I'm not trying to paint you in a corner. If you don't want, if that's either not your
But
position or you don't want to defend it,
yeah,
we can move
like
on.
I mean, like the thing is that I'm talking more about on like a mass scale. Like the thing is that they undoubtedly did this with what, you know, dozens, hundreds, you
Hmm.
know, maybe if it was a really good study, you know, thousands of people,
I
and
think
certainly that.
overall the study was 10,100 subjects, but yeah. Oh.
Okay, that's really good. That's a large sample size. But
Hmm.
like my point is that certainly there might have been like a marked or statistically significant uptick. But like the thing is that like I'm not disputing that there is in fact an uptick. I'm talking about like the size of it, how, when we put this in practice, like how effective is it going to be? Because if it's like 13%, for example, let's say
Mm-hmm.
you convince 13% or 20% or 30%, that is a sizable number.
Mm-hmm.
But like the thing is for building the type of mass movement that we want to see, I don't think that's nearly enough. And then the other thing is that like when it comes to like the types of arguments I'm using, like part of this is that there just isn't the issue that we're debating. I don't know that there's social scientific studies out there that examine, the what we're currently discussing. The you know
Well,
the efficacy of like empirical versus non-empirical arguments.
Well, so I mean, the other one, and I mentioned this to the previous person, is deep canvassing, and both of these seem to be relatively effective. In that, so the deep canvassing one, I forget exactly how large the effect was. Um, I mentioned this before, but we didn't go into it. Deep canvassing is where someone goes and talks with someone for, say, like an hour or something. In particular, in this study, they had a trans person or trans ally. They go and have like a half hour to hour conversation with someone, I believe in Florida, about whether trans people should have a non-discrimination law, that you shouldn't be able to discriminate against trans people in like workplaces and housing and shit like that. And there was I forget what the scale for this one is, but I can go and try and look it up. There was a big effect in this one of like talking to people, and it persisted for a while. But I want to say that the effect size are about the same between these two studies, but I'm not sure. One moment. I forget.
Yeah, I think like the objection I'll raise here is just kind of like my broader one is, I think like ultimately whether or not, because I'm not disputing the fact that like empirical arguments certainly can change some people's minds and they do have an impact on like how people think about or approach certain policies or issues. I think I just think in general, um like throwing studies and statistics at people isn't typically the best way of convincing them, or like because oftentimes people's political alignments are based off of like certain values or
Mm-hmm.
principles that they have that might not be, they might not even be able to fully articulate them. And so basically longer term engagement with that person and their views, their more political views, etc., is needed in order to like effectuate a more large change. Is basically, so there's that. But at the end of the day, my broader objection is that I don't see where the political will for this type of deep canvassing, for this type of like mass scale persuasion campaign is going to come from. I just don't see where that's going to come from. I don't know what you think of that.
Sure. I guess so. This is more getting to that second question, which is like, how do we get from just like persuasion to reformism, right? It's like more of a generic critique of reformism than empiricism in reformism. And if we want, we can talk about reformism. I'm totally happy to do that. I guess I am not disagreeing with you that it is useful to have non-empirical ways to appeal to people. The fundamental thing that I'm trying to present is especially in online discussions, in like written communication, it seems to be extremely powerful to have empirical evidence to change people's minds. It is so hard. Like one of the things, so deep canvassing is an incredibly time-consuming and impersonal thing. If it's 1 hour per person and it's an 8-hour workday, one person can only hit 8 people. An op-ed you write can hit 1,000,000 people. Even if it has like a tenth, a hundredth the size of the impact, it can have an aggregate and even larger impact than like deep canvassing. So for stuff like written communication or video communication, which is duplicated many times, it seems like there are certain ways of communicating that do change people's minds. I guess that's the fundamental way that I'm trying to approach this. I do think empirics are useful for changing people's minds, particularly in written communication. I don't know that we have too much disagreement here, but I think that empirics aren't as unuseful as I think you might have suggested them to be. And if I thought that and you were wrong, then I was wrong. Then I'm sorry to misrepresent you.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's still some things I disagree with you about in regards to like the empirical versus non-empirical arguments in terms, in regards to persuasion. But I think that's like beating a dead horse at this point, and like in general, I have like just a broader like a broader objection or critique of like this whole campaign of mass persuasion, deep canvassing, what have you, whatever term
Hmm.
you want to use, um, which I think is actually, better, more fleshed out, more interesting, because, quibbling over does this type of, logical argument work, or does this type of logical argument like work better, isn't like it should inform a little bit like how we approach our politics in interactions with others, but it's not like a huge issue. I think that the real problem that I have at the end of the day is you talk about it's very effective in written communication,
Hmm.
citing studies. But like the thing is that like and you mentioned an op-ed, but like the thing is like who is reading these op-eds? Primarily, I would say primarily middle to upper, middle class
Hmm.
on upwards people. These are the only people who read, New York Times, Wall
Sure.
Street Journal, Washington Post, Jacobin. Like, you look at the average income of the typical the income of the average Jacobin reader. It's going to be well above the income of the average American worker. We're talking about completely separate
Sure, I
demographics.
don't
Like the
disagree. I guess the problem is this is one of those things where it's like it's both and. It's that hey, effective written communication can also be paired with effective in-person communication to get these people politically involved and get them involved in like stuff like reading Jacobin. Um,
but
like
where's the political will that
sure,
like where are these hordes of people who are going to go out and start deep canvassing? Where do those people come from? Where's the political will?
so I don't like obviously deep canvassing across the country. Probably there isn't political will for that right now. But even you mentioned the squad earlier. One of the big things that AOC is pushing for, and ironically enough, Beto O'Rourke is pushing for, is long term in person canvassing. One of the things that Hirsch talked about a whole lot is having year round canvassers who are involved in fundamentally changing people's minds. One and two, getting them out to vote in November, um, or whenever local races are. Um, and I think that you're starting to see like people in the Democratic Party in particular shift towards this form of organization, as evidenced by both Beto and AOC agreeing on something, because it seems to work. So I think the will isn't there yet, but it's possibly moving that direction. And I guess I'm also just suggesting, as socialists, we are the minority movement. Right? We could not tomorrow. I think it's maybe like 10% of people agree with us, 5. Um, I think that it is our duty to be as effective as possible in trying to change other people's minds, um, if we think that our movement is worth winning, as it were.
I mean, I'm pessimistic, but that doesn't mean, I'm whether if I am the lone voice crying out in the wilderness that capitalism is evil, blah blah blah, then
Mm-hmm.
I will do that. I'll put forth that effort, just because I believe it's the right thing to do, even if it's completely pointless or hopeless, whatever. But like
Mm-hmm.
my point is that like I will acknowledge that within mainstream political discourse, part of it is the activists generation Z, and there's been an uptick in regards to like people talking, using the language of activism, talking about organizing in the mainstream. um but again, like as you said, like the will isn't there yet. And I think with and I actually, because Hirsch sounded familiar, and I actually
Mm-hmm.
realized where I recognized the name from. I believe he did. The Atlantic featured a piece written by him where he
Mm-hmm.
essentially condensed the arguments made in his book regarding political hobbyism, because like essentially what we are doing right now is engaging in political hobbyism. What most of your followers do is probably engage in political hobbyism. I doubt, and this isn't meant to be an insult. I'm not out there, my organizing days are, kind of over. I've been arrested. I'm
Mm-hmm.
past that. I'm going into academia. That's not what I want to do with my life.
Mm-hmm.
But my point is that like when you have things like the internet, when you have all of these new forms of culture that like encourage and draw people into political hobbyism, I don't see where, these masses of people who are going to put in the time, put in the work to engage in the type of organizing we need. I just don't like it. As you acknowledge, it's not there yet. I don't see where that is going to come from, because it's so much easier for people to retweet AOC talking about the importance of organizing than it is to actually go out and organize. And I don't think people really have the political will or the inclination to do that. And I think structural inequities make it difficult for people to do that. And I think those structural inequities are only going to be exacerbated over time, which is why I'm so goddamn pessimistic.
Sure. I mean, I guess that I think it's easy to be pessimistic, but the last election was the highest turnout we've seen in years. Democrats successfully did persuasion and turnout in Georgia. That was an example of like a combination of grassroots and canvassing. It seems like these policies can work. I think reading Hirsch made me simultaneously very pessimistic because it suggests that a lot of the flaws in the American politics are, as you say, with the lack of political will of people to be engaged in politics. They are with a lot of individuals making the choice, fundamentally, to not participate in politics. But simultaneously, they also suggest to me a great optimism because these things can be changed. Grassroots organizing does work. You can do it. The DSA can do it. Like the Dems can do it. I guess that I think that I share some pessimism in that the structures of the system are maybe aligned against us, but part of the point of reformism is to change those structures. One of the simplest things, when you read about like that's a little esoteric. One of the things you can do, for example, is make it more likely that you can pass things via the ballot box. You can decrease the standards required to get something to like a direct referendum. That should tend to encourage more left-wing policy because left-wing policy tends, not always, but tends to be more popular than right-wing policy. You can change the structure. The structure is not this like fixed monolith. And I think part of the point of reform is that the options to me are basically, I think revolution is not going to happen in the United States, and if it does happen,
I would agree.
Sure. So then I think that's out. Revolution's option is out. So the remaining options are try reform or black pill. It's either like just be a doomer, think that your goals will never be successful, and just retreat to academia, retreat to like a hedonistic life or something, right? Just give up, or try reform. And so fundamentally, I think that if you genuinely care about socialism, even if you don't think it's a great chance, even if it's a long shot, reform is the only remaining shot, or retreat.
I mean, you might disagree with this, but I think the left communist, the Bordiga-esque arguments brought out in regards to how reform pacifies the revolutionary potentialities of the working class. I personally subscribe to. I understand you briefly talked about that in your last conversation.
Mm-hmm.
But the thing is, oh shit, I lost my train of thought.
So I think the broad question was like, should we be pessimistic, or should we try to do something even if it's not a great shot? That was like, I guess, the way I was framing it. But you might disagree with the framing.
Yeah, and I no. Oh, okay. And, you were talking about the making it easier to put in like ballot measures. So
just as a specific example, there's lots of other reforms. Yeah, that's just a simple one.
Yeah, no, and I mean, I think obviously there are ways we can make our that you can do a social wealth fund. You can have some Warren or Bernie-esque proposal to hand a company's shares over to put them in a fund for workers. There are ways in which we can enact left-wing policies. These things in theory can, or technically can, be implemented. I don't disagree with that.
Mm-hmm.
However, again, it just comes back to like the system, and this gets a lot into kind of the thought of Mark Fisher and even Nick Land a little bit, is that it goes back to like political will for me. The political will of the masses, which we see within these masses, or the general population, the working class, whatever term you want to use. These are the people that are going to spearhead the movement, that are going to push through the types of changes we're going to see. And I don't see a way of that mass of people becoming radicalized. I don't think these, I would say, the class conscious segments of the population, I would include us in that category. Most of your followers or viewers. I don't think there's enough
Hmm.
political will to radicalize those segments of the population that we would need. That huge mass of people that we would need in order to push through the types of changes we want.
Well, I
Um,
guess the problem I have with this is it feels like I know the type of change we want is like socialism, but when we're talking about like even just incremental reforms that make it easier to get stuff through, it seems like that will is very much there. Like incremental reforms like $15 minimum wage seem like they're going to get through at the federal level. Incremental reforms like in pretty substantial green climate policies seem like they're going to get through at the federal level. It
I
seems like
mean,
even the Democratic Party has the will for these, even though it's like a center to center left party. Um,
the thing is that like I would just in regards to the certainly the like the Biden administration is going to rejoin the Paris Climate Agreement. Whether that's too little, too late, I'm not a climate scientist, and I'm not going to be the one who is going to be overhauling the
mhm,
American economy, our energy sector. So I can't really speak as to as to that whether or not we're in the clear.
mhm,
Um, but I think like for example, like and this is just the nature of electoral politics because Biden may get reelected to a second term. He may not get reelected to a second term, and it might be a Republican who like this is just like the pendulum of electoral politics. Our party, I'm not a Democrat, so maybe I
mhm.
shouldn't use the term our party, but the Democratic Party is one of two, and at the end of the day, there's going to be obstruction. There's going to be a rollback once the other party comes into power. Um, we're barely gonna have the Senate. Um, so I don't see like massive systemic changes occurring. I mean, I don't know if you're very hopeful about the the incoming Biden administration. I'm not very hopeful about it. The
Mhm.
minimum wage, yeah, certainly that will increase over time, but that's how it works. Like iron law of wages, the wages will rise in order to sustain the just barely sustain the workers who live on the minimum wage. So I don't view necessarily like $15 an hour as like this big victory that is actually signaling or indicating like an oncoming socialist or blue wave. I just view that as like economic pressures will naturally produce a desire in people to like raise the minimum wage a bit because working class people can no longer really afford to live off of it, and so it'll be bumped up, and then in like 20-30 years when working class people are struggling again, it will be bumped up again. So I don't think looking to like minimum wage increases, in this case, like the minimum wage increase, long overdue, $15 an hour doesn't really cut it anymore. I just don't see any reason to be hopeful, I guess.
Sure. I mean, I guess I don't so I think that the empiricism argument has somewhat been like moved on from.
Yeah, yeah.
Um,
I
I
figured we would end up talking about electoral politics because that's my primary disagreement with your brand of politics.
Sure. And I guess I just wanted to set like a little time limit for myself because I don't want to go too late because otherwise I'll mess up my sleep schedule. So maybe like
Totally.
a few more minutes and then maybe we could wrap it up. Sorry.
Of course.
Um,
No problem.
so I agree that there are many reasons to be pessimistic. I would also say there are many reasons to be optimistic. The one of the two things that we're noticing is so the two, if we want to look at demographic trends, education is rising more quickly in America than it has at any point in history. Each year, about 0.5% of the population gains a college degree. That's partly due to the death of the boomers, and it's partly due to new college degrees granted. Um, and the second demographic trend is the increasing diversification of the country, and the related non-demographic but cultural trend of decreasing racism and decreasing bigotry within the country, which I know a lot of leftists don't. We often don't think about that. We think about how racist the country is. There has been a long-term decline, and you can see it in lots of ways. Like one poll that I like to cite comes from Pew, which just looks at like Generation Z in the Republican and the Democratic Party. And let me go grab that Generation Z. This one. So Generation Silent, generation Republicans, 20% of them, just 1 in 5, think that, quote, blacks are treated less fairly than whites in our country today, which is like an incredibly weak statement. Virtually every generation of Democrats, 80% of them, agrees with that. But you go to Republicans, for 3 generations, Boomer, Silent, Gen X, it's 20% of them, only 1 in 5, say blacks are treated less fairly. Millennial, 30. Generation Z, 43. That's pretty rapid increases. In a variety of ways, you can see that even within the Republican Party, there is a decrease, particularly among Generation Z, of racism. Part of that's due to diversity in the new Republican Party, and part of that is due to just people being less racist. And so I think that in turn is explained for by increasing diversification and contact hypothesis and rising education, and in general just declining racism. So I think these are good, and I'll just to package this all up. These to me are really good because, like I said, social issues are the ways that people vote nowadays. So if we can either make issues more salient economically, which seems like that's one good bet that seems to be happening with stuff like Medicare for all. That's like seems like Biden's moved left pretty substantially relative to like 2008 or something. Or if we can make social issues, if they remain salient, but people become significantly less racist, that significantly weakens the Republican, like, white majority sort of coalition in the long run. So I think these are hopeful, if not in the short, but in the long run. And again, I would appeal to David Shore on that one. He's got lots of research about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think at the end of the day, though, I think there's I think one, as people become more educated, in theory, they become more left-leaning, more liberal, but, they also tend to draw, a larger income. And I would say that, these are the people that Hirsch, if I'm not mistaken, talks about as being more likely to be sucked into the black hole that is political hobbyism, the people that are less likely to engage in, tangible action, tangible organizing. So I think that's cause for concern. And I think, there are similar highly educated countries in Europe that certainly might be more sympathetic, we might move more.
They've had basically the same trend. I don't want to belabor the point too much, but like in virtually every country in like the first world, the left wing party, which was in the past dominated by the working class, is now dominated by the highly educated class.
I mean, I think this is what I would say. Like, this is what led to the Blairite members of the Labor Party taking control. This is there are a lot of political scientists who have examined how these left-wing parties have turned more towards technocratic liberalism. So I don't view the higher education as necessarily a good thing. I think it will cause people to favor more of a technocratic liberalism, and 2, I think it will cause people to get drawn into this sort of political hobbyism. And then the other thing is that I'm not sure that a softening on various social issues, I think, just because people believe in systemic racism does not mean, they might support affirmative action, and they might want, anti-bias training for police, but the fundamental structure of the capitalist state is going to remain intact. I guess
Sorry.
Yeah, no, you go. I'm finished.
No, so I agree that like most of what we're talking about here is not abolishing capitalism. It's getting to a stage where we can like get closer to talking about abolishing capitalism. Like there was basically a global shift 2-3 steps back to the economic right from the 80s to the 2010s or so. And I think that since then, you've started to see things curve back, and now the left has been rising again. Keir Starmer is no like Corbyn by his economic policies, but he's also no Blairite either. He's somewhere in between. Yeah. There's been a shift left. The Democrats have shifted left. I know sometimes doesn't seem like it, but like relative to what they were talking about in 2008, they're significantly more left. There's a really neat graph that I can go get from Alternet, which demonstrates that the Democrats are basically unified in voting pro-labor whenever they get the chance, which was not the case. Sorry.
Well, yeah, and this is like, again, some of this stuff I won't dispute. I think there is good reason to believe that we can perhaps see an expanded American welfare state in the future. how far into the future that that's going to be, how expansive or robust this welfare state is going to be, that remains a matter of debate or whatever. But like at the end of the day, I think what this conversation will inevitably lead to is like, okay, we've achieved like some type of pleasant social democracy where people are
Hmm.
taken care of and like children are fed
Well,
and have access to education. I guess what is your theory of
s-
you know
so
reaching
I
socialism after that?
So sure. So I think that so Danabo, I just turn off my camera for a moment. The I think the answer is experimentation. Like part of how we got to today is we experimented with social democratic policies, and some worked and some didn't. And we're over time, countries seem to have adopted the policies which did. Um, so the suggestion is we in social democracies today, even the very flawed, often now ruled by neoliberal technocrats of the right and the left. Social democracies of today, we see experiments that can be done to move us further to the left. An example I constantly point to is so-called preventative housing in Finland and now the United Kingdom. It's called Housing First in America, and I believe it's called Housing First in Finland, and I believe in the UK it's called preventative housing mostly. It's basically the idea that you give everyone a house, which
Yeah.
sorry, go ahead.
Oh, just no. I've written on these in for poli sci on housing first policies for poli sci. So yeah, I'm familiar with it.
Sure. Well, clearly I was simply speaking for the benefit of the
Oh, oh,
viewer, right?
oh, yeah. Sorry, my apologies.
No. That was not genuine. Sorry. So I tend to explain things because I assume people don't know. So I apologize.
Yeah, yeah. No,
And
you're fine.
it's useful for people who don't know when they do watch the stream. So that's why. Let's see. I don't know your personal positions on it, but to me, moving to a situation where housing is basically a right, that seems like a big shift left. Before we can even talk about that, we need to get to the place where people don't have widespread like housing insecurity like they do in the United States. You got to be a social democracy to experiment with socialism, is I guess the way I think about it. Um, and so we can't even talk about doing that before we get there in the first place. The other way that I think about this is I mentioned in my previous conversation this idea of policy adoption bias, that when you change what the status quo is, you change what people think normal is. There's a reason the NHS has been so hard to pull back. And there's a general term for this. It's called welfare retrenchment. It is generally very difficult to pull back welfare from people who are currently receiving it. Sometimes this is good. If it's like a good policy, it makes it very hard to undo. And sometimes it's bad. If it's like a really shitty welfare program, it's really hard to undo because the people currently on it really don't want to get off it. One of the prime examples of this are like oil subsidies, sugar subsidies, corn subsidies. It's really, really hard to undo those. So I guess the hope in part is as we shift left, it changes what people think is normal, and that in turn makes it possible to shift even more left. Um, so that's my basic thought there. I understand it's possible to be pessimistic about all of this, but I think that the very long trends of history are bending towards justice in whatever his name's words were.
I believe is that King.
It's either King or some SCOTUS. I don't know.
Um, yeah. I mean, I think there are. I like overall. I think that, economic pressures, will eventually result in the capitalist state making concessions, building a more larger, more expansive welfare state in order to pacify the population. And I just don't. One, I think that you can have a welfare state in which people are taken care of
Mm-hmm.
whilst still limiting democratic accountability, which I think is the case. And I think the American, democratic republic, I think you would agree, has become a lot less democratic over the past 40 years as things have been gerrymandered, as structural inequities have prevented people from voting, as voting rights have been
Mm,
rolled back.
that
Um,
that's a hard one in total because this was also the era of like women increasing voter participation, of like it becoming normal for blacks to vote. Um, I don't want to cast my die on that one. I think that in some ways it's gotten harder, but in some ways it's gotten much easier. That's like a mixed bag.
I guess like overall, I don't, I think there are reasons, like capitalism is relentlessly adaptive. I think that there are plenty of reasons to believe that we will see an expanded welfare state. Um, I think political will and to actually go out and organize has been on the decline and will only continue to decline as there have been as structural inequities worsen in some senses, and also as there become outlets for people's political rage.
Well, that's actually,
Um,
I actually wanted to mention about that. So, one of the things that I think Hirsch talks about is that people who are educated are uniquely able to be politically activated, in that they have the most free time and the most income, and they are often the most politically extreme. His suggestion, I think, in part, is that they aren't just due to a lack of organization. So, I lack a little bit of the pessimism there. I think that if you can organize them, you can even point to like dumbass people like Destiny, right? They can get out, mostly college educated people, right? The people that are going there are generally college educated NEETs or college educated, people working. They go and they canvass, and you can get them out to vote if you have the structure to do so. That's literally one of the anecdotes that Hirsch points to is the integration of a local Democratic district with a college campus, and it seemed enormously successful. I think that I think that there is a pool of people who are very able and very willing to be active, but they need to be activated. Um, I
I,
guess I
I
have a lot less pessimism there.
yeah, I guess it comes back to like that. I think that's a really big if. I think that I just don't see such a structure to quote unquote like activate these people, being created or constructed. Um, I think part of it is I just have a lot. I think late capitalism destroys the radical potentialities of the subject or whatever, to use like the theoretical jargon.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so it goes back to I just don't think there's and I feel like we're repeating we're kind of talking ourselves into circles at this point.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I
Well,
do want to let you get to bed. So if you want to
sure.
give
So I guess maybe so. I'll give a closing thought, and I'll give you the final closing thought. I guess my closing thoughts are one. I think that there's a reasonable amount of evidence, like reasonable amount of pretty strong evidence that empirics can change minds. I understand there's limitations to them. I don't like. I'm not like spouting off stats usually in casual conversations, except with close friends. I deluge them with stats, but the average person, I mostly, if I know something to be true, I will just say, hey, they're experts in this field. They seem to say this. This is what seems to be true. Um, then on the second note of like whether to be pessimistic, I think that there are plenty of reasons to be pessimistic, and I agree with you about a lot of them. There are a lot of unfortunate things there. I have faith in part because of the long-term trends. I sent you this really neat graph of the percent of people who voted in the presidential election as a percent of the population, and you can see it's just been going up. It only goes till 2012, but it's been in the long term enormously going up. It sometimes it can be hard to think about these things in the super long term, but we are getting more democratic as like a world. We are getting more democratic as a society. Even in dumb shit like felon voting rights, like that should be obvious. I think even in dumb shit like that, we are expanding. Um, so I think the long term trend is hopeful because of the trends like increasing education, the long term trends of people increasingly shifting slowly to the left. Um, that's my take. So I am hopeful, and I think empirics can be useful. And I will give you the closing thought now. So whatever you like to say, and then at the end I'll ask you to shill. So first closing thought.
yeah, no. Well, first of all, I just want to say thank you for having me on to have this conversation. I know I can
Of
be,
course.
yeah, I have a tendency to interrupt and can sometimes be a bit overly aggressive, but I've really enjoyed this conversation. Um, very, very substantive, you're a very intelligent guy. So just wanted to extend my thanks first. Um, yeah, but
Simp.
I guess it,
I,
um, simping on the daily.
mm-hmm.
Um,
I appreciate it. Thank you.
Of course. But yeah, no, I just I think there are a lot of reasons to be concerned that one, I think voter turnout I'm looking at the graphs right now. I have
Mm-hmm.
graphs pulled up on my computer. Yeah, there are slight increases obviously when it comes to a presidential election. I don't
Mm-hmm.
know how statistically significant they are. I don't know
Sure.
I don't know the details. However, I think, in regards to things becoming more diverse, I think, this past election we saw worrying trends about a lot more people of color, or like a notable amount of people of color becoming more comfortable with Republicans. And then I think there's overall there's the issue of Republican gerrymandering, voter rights. Certainly we have isolated cases in blue states, felons being extended, or being granted again their right to vote.
Mm-hmm.
But like overall, I'm very concerned about voting rights, about gerrymandering,
Sure.
and I think that is, allows
It,
Republicans to cement their power in the Congress, in Senate and the House, which further allows them to have say over justices, which who exert control over voting rights and
it,
gerrymandering. So
I agree
yeah,
with
I
you.
guess.
Sorry, I will interject and I'll let you finish again. If there's one reason I keep shilling David Shore, one of his big things is to try and push for stuff like a federal ban on gerrymandering. Yeah, I agree. Whether we'll see something like that in HR1 is a different question. Sorry, please conclude your finishing thoughts.
Yeah. Well, now I'm definitely, just because you mentioned him so many times, I'm definitely going to check out David Shore. So you can,
Sure.
you want to,
See,
an
simping works.
eager simping works. But yeah, I guess I don't mean to be a doomer. I don't mean to be pessimistic. It's just
Mm-hmm.
that I think that's the that's the position of analytical honesty, and that is my first and foremost commitment, is to analytical honesty. um
Sure.
Obviously I think I come at this from a very different angle than you do. And I don't want to discount, to get back to the
Mm-hmm.
first half of our conversation. I don't want to discount the use, the usefulness of empirical social science in certain subject areas. It definitely is useful, and it serves its purpose. I just come from a much more theoretical background, and I think there are lots of unverifiable issues, problems, or ones that cannot be handled by empirical social science, that I think that causes me to be more theoretically inclined. Anyway, yeah, again, really appreciate this discussion. So
Sure.
thank you for that.
Yeah, thanks for coming on. I'm glad it was really competitive. I've loved the blood sports. I think that the part where I crushed your ideas under my boot was really exciting. Um, so the shill portion. So I guess I'll do the same thing as the beginning. Why don't you tell us who you are, what you do, where people can find you, and one thing you'd like to shout
Um, yeah. So again, my name is Nora. I'm an aspiring academic. I study European intellectual history at Yale. And thing I want to shout out, I shouted out my Twitter before. I'm not
out.
going to do that again. I'm not that narcissistic. I will shout out, um, since you mentioned the progress, that the arc of history bends towards progress or justice or what have you.
Uh
I will bring up Walter Benjamin's On the Philosophy of History, um, which is a really great, really eclectic critique of notions of progress. It's a very interesting essay. It's written in the form of a series of theses. Um, a lot of the arguments he makes are very metaphorical, very image based. So it reads very poetically, very beautifully. Um, it's rather quick read, very interesting. Um, yeah, and I also think, even though there are very difficult portions of it, there are parts of it that are extremely accessible, and every time I read it, I come away with something new. So I definitely recommend that. That's the thing I'll shill.
Sure. Well, I'm glad we've got some based text. I've also posted their Twitter link, Theodor Awhoreno. Um, Thank you for coming on. Thank you for a lovely evening, and I'm probably gonna head to bed after this. Um, any last thoughts?
No. Keep up the good work. I really appreciate that, your willingness to host discussions like this. I think it's beneficial for all parties, all spectators. So yeah,
Yeah. Well, thank you for coming on. I really appreciate it.
of course. Have a good night.
You too.
Wake up, liberal. I love you.
All right. So, like I said, I'm gonna go to bed. Brief recap. I felt the strongest parts of my argument were the empirics on the use of empirics, because I had empirics and they did not. So I feel like that naturally somewhat goes there. Um, so I guess I'm somewhat destined to win that one if I think empirics matter and then I provide empirics, right? I felt that she did her argument that you need to focus on people's daily needs rather than just appealing them with studies was absolutely valid. I, however, don't think it's a contradiction to say that empirics matter. I think it as, if you want, most people listening to this are not going to be like leftist intellectuals or leftist media hosts or whatever. But if you want to be one and you want to put media out there, it's important to use maximally effective persuasion techniques. It's important to base your policies on evidence, so that you don't advocate things that end up hurting people and therefore hurting their faith in like leftism or the system. Not the system, like the utility of like economic democracy. And second, we had a discussion about economic pessimism, and she suggests that there's a lot of reasons to structurally to be worried about the long-term trends of democracy and the short-term failures of reformism. I think a lot of those are valid. However, I think it's worth noting that even with the relatively limited political capital that the modern socialist movement has, even stuff like the DSA, it seems like the American public has been able to shift left a whole bunch of issues, such as the $15 minimum wage, and put them into public consciousness. So I think that while some pessimism is merited, a lot of very good long-term demographic trends, such as rising education, rising diversity, rising tolerance, rising left-wing beliefs, all of these in the long term seem to suggest that a better future is feasible, and is not too unrealistic. Only bloomerism allowed here. I can't prove which way the future is going to go. Maybe there's going to be a coup. What's it like in 2 days? I think that's the inauguration. In 2 days, right, there's going to be a coup. Maybe it's all done. Maybe all this is worthless. I can't prove the future. All I can do is suggest, based on what evidence I have, the way I think the future will go. So that's about it.